Welcome back, listeners. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into a really pivotal moment in English history. The Glorious Revolution of 1688.
Okay.
Now, you've probably heard the term.
Yes.
We're going to be examining it from a Catholic perspective.
Okay.
Specifically, looking at how King James II's faith
Right.
ultimately led to his removal from the throne.
Mm-hmm.
You've provided some fascinating sources on this, and I'm
Yeah.
really curious to see what we uncover.
It's interesting because the standard narrative often portrays James as this tyrant trying to force Catholicism on England.
Right.
But, as we delve into these primary sources, I think a more intricate picture emerges.
Okay.
One that really makes you question those assumptions.
Okay, so let's unpack this then.
Okay.
To really grasp what happened with James II,
Yes.
we need to rewind a bit to his brother,
Okay.
Charles II, and the Restoration.
Absolutely. That context is key.
Yeah.
When Charles II returned to England in 1660, he issued the Declaration of Breda,
Okay.
promising some degree of religious liberty.
Right.
He even uses the phrase liberty to tender consciences.
Oh, wow.
And this was meant to reassure those who had been persecuted during the interregnum.
So a king returning from exile, trying to smooth things over, seems logical enough, but then Parliament steps in and kind of muddies the waters, right? They enacted the Clarendon Code.
Yes.
These laws aimed at suppressing Puritanism, which, even though not directly targeting Catholics, definitely had a ripple effect.
Yes, that's right. Parliament at this point was dominated by Anglicans who were deeply suspicious of any deviation from the established church.
Right.
So, for instance, the Corporation Act
Okay.
barred non-Anglicans from holding public office.
So essentially controlling local politics.
Yes, exactly. And then you have the Act of Uniformity, which forced all clergy to adhere to the Anglican Book of Common Prayer.
Right.
This led to the expulsion of many Puritan ministers.
Wow. So you can see how this climate of religious tension starts to build.
Yeah, and this all happens before James II even takes the throne.
Exactly.
It's like the stage is already set for conflict.
Exactly. And then in 1662, Charles II tries to ease some of these restrictions with his own Declaration of Indulgence, which basically released imprisoned Puritans.
So another attempt.
It's a bold move, but Parliament predictably pushes back.
Yeah.
And forces him to withdraw it.
Of course.
So you have this constant tug of war between the Crown wanting a more tolerant approach and Parliament fiercely defending Anglican dominance.
Right. It's this power struggle between, who gets to decide.
Yeah.
And into this already volatile situation steps James II, a devout Catholic who ascends the throne in 1685.
Yeah.
Talk about walking into a hornet's nest.
Yes, and to complicate matters further, James, upon becoming king, he gives this somewhat vague assurance to the Privy Council, pledging to uphold the government in church and state as established by law. It's a very carefully worded statement.
It is.
It doesn't really clarify his stance on religious tolerance.
Exact.
So it's almost like he's trying to play both sides.
Yes.
Reassure the Anglican establishment, while also hinting at a more inclusive approach. But that ambiguity probably just fueled suspicion.
It did.
Especially given his Catholic faith.
Absolutely. And this suspicion really explodes into this series of accusations against James.
Okay.
The source you provided lists 19 points.
Wow.
It's like this laundry list of grievances, all designed to paint him as this overreaching, tyrannical monarch.
Wow, 19 points. That's a lot to unpack.
It is.
Which ones really jump out at you?
Well, accusation number 2 gets right to the heart of the matter.
Okay.
James's belief in the divine right of kings.
Wait, could you unpack that a bit for our listeners?
Sure.
What exactly does that mean?
So the divine right of kings was this idea that a king's authority came directly from God and couldn't be challenged by earthly powers like Parliament. Okay.
So any attempt to limit the king's power was seen as going against God's will.
Right.
James, being a devout Catholic, probably believed this to some extent.
Right.
And his actions, like suspending the Test Act and issuing general indulgences, were seen as him trying to flex his royal muscles and assert that absolute authority.
Hold on. Let's break that down even further for our listeners.
Sure.
The Test Act and general indulgences.
Okay.
What were those exactly?
So the Test Act, established in 1673, basically required anyone holding public office to swear an oath denying certain Catholic doctrines and take communion in the Church of England.
So it was a way to keep Catholics out of positions of power.
Exactly.
Got it.
General indulgences, on the other hand, were these declarations by the king that exempted people from penalties imposed by specific laws.
Okay.
Think of it like the king granting a pardon.
Okay. That's helpful.
Yeah.
So James suspending the Test Act and issuing these general indulgences.
Yeah.
Wasn't he just trying to be more inclusive?
He was.
To create a level playing field for all religions.
Yes, and it's important to remember his motivations.
Right.
James was a devout Catholic,
Mm-hmm.
and he genuinely wanted religious freedom for everyone.
Okay.
He saw these laws as discriminatory and unjust.
Right.
But his actions were met with fierce opposition.
Yeah.
Especially from Parliament.
Of course.
They saw it as a blatant power grab, a way for him to stack the deck in favor of Catholics.
It's that constant tension we were talking about.
Exactly.
The king pushing for tolerance and Parliament pushing back to maintain Anglican control.
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's move on then to another accusation that really stands out.
Okay.
Number 8.
Right.
Which focuses on the brutal treatment of the Covenanters in Scotland.
Yes.
So first, who were the Covenanters?
These were Scottish Presbyterians.
Okay.
Who were fiercely opposed to any attempt to impose Anglicanism on them.
Right.
They signed these covenants.
These pledges to uphold their Presbyterian beliefs and often resisted the Crown's authority.
Okay.
And we have to acknowledge this was a really brutal period, full of harsh punishments.
Right.
But even within that context, the use of torture was controversial.
Right.
And the source mentions a specific instance where James may have been present during the torture of a man named Sproul.
That's a chilling detail.
It is.
Whether he actively condoned the torture or was just present.
Right.
It certainly fuels the narrative of him as a tyrant.
It does.
It really puts a dent in his image as a champion of religious freedom, doesn't it?
It does. It raises questions.
Yeah.
For sure.
Okay, and then there's accusation number 13.
Okay.
Which focuses on the imprisonment of 7 bishops.
Yes.
This one is particularly significant.
It is.
Because it really captures this escalating conflict between James II and the Anglican establishment.
Right.
Okay, so walk us through that.
What happened?
In 1688, James, wanting to further his goal of religious tolerance,
orders his declaration of indulgence be read in all churches.
All right.
7 bishops, fearing this would undermine the Church of England's authority, petition against it.
So they basically said, no, we're not going to read your declaration.
Yeah.
Pretty bold move.
It was.
What did James do?
He had them imprisoned for seditious libel.
Wow.
Their petition was seen by many as this defense of the Anglican Church.
Okay.
But James viewed it as a challenge to his authority, a direct act of defiance.
So you have this king who's advocating for religious freedom, but is also cracking down on bishops who disagree with him.
Yeah.
It seems like a bit of a contradiction.
It does.
But again, I guess we have to remember the political climate.
Right.
England was deeply suspicious of Catholicism.
Yes.
And many saw this as James trying to impose his religion on the country.
Exactly.
So even if his intentions were good, his actions were perceived as this threat to the established order.
Yes.
He seems to be making a lot of enemies.
He is.
And this pattern continues with accusation number 16, which claims that James was amassing this huge Catholic army to force his religion on England.
Right.
But the source actually challenges this claim pretty directly.
It does.
Really? What does it say?
It provides a breakdown of the English, Irish, and Scottish armies at the time, showing that they were actually quite small with a majority of Protestant officers and soldiers.
Wow.
Even in Ireland, where James might have had more leeway, the military remained predominantly Protestant.
So this image of a massive Catholic army poised to take over England?
Yes.
Sounds more like propaganda than reality.
It does call that accusation into question.
Okay.
Definitely.
And finally, let's touch on accusation number 17, which deals with James's stance on the Huguenots.
Right.
French Protestants fleeing persecution under King Louis XV.
Yes.
Now, didn't Louis XIV revoke the Edict of Nantes?
He did.
Stripping the Huguenots of their religious freedoms?
Yes, and initially James was sympathetic to them.
Okay.
He even issued a financial appeal to help them settle in England. But as the situation in France escalated, his position became more complicated.
Right.
Some Huguenots started using the platform that he had given them to criticize not just Louis XIV, but Catholicism in general.
So even acts of compassion could be twisted and used against him in this climate of anti-Catholic paranoia.
Exactly. He was accused of hypocrisy.
Great.
With some claiming that he secretly supported Louis XIV's persecution.
Yeah.
But it seems he was just trying to do the right thing.
Yeah.
While also navigating this incredibly tricky political situation.
It's a tightrope walk, isn't it?
It is.
Wow. It's clear from these accusations that James, despite his genuine desire for religious freedom, was facing some serious opposition.
He was, and unfortunately, some of his own actions, even if well-intentioned, played right into the hands of his enemies.
So it sounds like we need to delve deeper into this question.
Yes.
Was James truly a tyrant? Or was he more of a tragic figure, a victim of his own circumstances and the anti-Catholic biases of his time?
That's precisely the question we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive.
So we've been looking at these accusations against James II.
Right.
And it seems like a lot of them stem from this deep-seated fear of Catholicism in England at the time.
Yes.
But to really understand James II, we need to broaden our perspective, right?
Absolutely.
Look at the wider context of religious tolerance in Europe.
Yeah.
During that period.
It's easy to get caught up in the English perspective.
Yeah.
But when we zoom out and look at the bigger picture,
Right.
things get a lot more nuanced.
Okay.
For instance, the source you provided points to Poland and Lithuania.
Okay.
These were Catholic countries that had a long history of religious pluralism with legal protections for different faiths.
Interesting.
Poland was even known as a safe haven for Jews.
That's a really striking contrast to how James II is often portrayed.
It is.
As this Catholic king trying to force his religion on everyone. It challenges the idea that Catholicism inherently equals intolerance, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
And it highlights the fact that religious tolerance wasn't just a Catholic versus Protestant issue.
Right.
Political and social factors played a huge role.
Okay.
The source also contrasts Poland with Holland,
Okay.
which was considered a refuge for those fleeing religious persecution. But ironically, Catholics in Holland faced restrictions.
Oh, wow.
They couldn't openly practice their faith and were denied certain rights.
So even in societies that were perceived as tolerant, there was still this undercurrent of prejudice against Catholics.
Yes.
It's like tolerance was selective.
It was.
And Catholicism was often the target.
Often the target, exactly.
Okay, and to complicate things even further,
Yeah.
let's look at James II's policies in the American colonies.
Okay.
Now remember, before he became king, he was the Duke of York.
Yes.
And had quite a bit of authority over colonial affairs.
He did.
Particularly in New York.
Especially in New York.
Right, he was given this huge land grant.
Yes.
Basically everything between the Connecticut and Delaware rivers.
That's right.
And what's interesting is that in New York,
yes,
as well as New Jersey and Pennsylvania, James actually promoted religious freedom.
He did.
He ensured that different faiths could coexist peacefully.
Yes.
So the same James II, who was accused of tyranny in England, is advocating for religious liberty in America.
Yeah.
It's a pretty stark contrast.
It is a stark contrast.
What do you make of that?
Well, it suggests that James was a more complex figure than the traditional narrative suggests.
Right.
His actions in the colonies indicate that he genuinely believed in religious freedom.
Okay.
At least in principle. And it wasn't just a hands-off approach.
Right.
He took concrete steps to protect minority groups.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. The source mentions that James went out of his way to protect the Jewish community in England.
Okay.
He intervened in legal cases to stop their persecution and ensured they could practice their faith freely.
Okay.
And what's even more telling is that after he was deposed, the Jewish community faced renewed restrictions and pressure to convert to Christianity.
That's incredible. So James II, the so-called Catholic tyrant, was actually more tolerant towards Jews than his Protestant successors.
It seems that way.
It really makes you question this whole narrative of the Glorious Revolution, doesn't it?
It does.
Was it really a victory for freedom and liberty?
It definitely raises some uncomfortable questions.
Yeah.
The way the Glorious Revolution is often presented.
Right.
This triumph over tyranny.
Yeah.
It just doesn't hold up when you look at the impact on religious freedom, particularly for Catholics.
Okay, so let's unpack that then.
Okay.
How did the revolution affect religious freedom in England?
Well, William of Orange, who replaced James II, who wasn't exactly a champion of religious tolerance, he invaded with a largely foreign army. London was actually under Dutch military control.
Wow.
During the parliament that deposed James.
Yeah.
The legality of William and Mary's claim to the throne was, well, let's just say it was pretty flimsy.
It sounds less like a glorious revolution,
Yeah.
more like a hostile takeover.
That's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
And the aftermath wasn't exactly a golden age of religious liberty.
Right.
In fact, things got worse for Catholics in England.
Okay.
The Toleration Act of 1689, which is often celebrated as this landmark for religious freedom,
right,
specifically excluded Catholics from its protections.
Wait, hold on. The Toleration Act didn't actually tolerate Catholics?
It did not.
That's pretty ironic.
It is very ironic.
Yeah.
The act granted freedom of worship to Protestant dissenters, like the Puritans and Quakers. But it specifically denied those same freedoms to Catholics.
Wow.
They continued to face legal discrimination, social stigma,
right,
and couldn't hold public office.
So the revolution that was supposed to usher in an era of greater freedom actually reinforced the marginalization of Catholics.
Sadly, that's true.
Wow.
The revolution was ultimately a power grab by the Protestant elite.
Right.
And it solidified their dominance over English society.
And it wasn't just England, right?
No, it wasn't.
You mentioned that after the revolution,
yes,
things got tougher for Catholics in the American colonies as well.
Yes, there was a backlash there too.
Really?
Take Maryland, for instance.
Okay.
It was founded by Catholics.
Right.
And had a long history of religious tolerance.
Okay.
But after James was deposed, Catholics in Maryland faced persecution.
Oh, wow.
They were excluded from public office,
right,
couldn't educate their children in the Catholic faith.
Wow.
And even had to pay double taxes.
It's tragic, isn't it?
It is a tragedy.
This revolution, hailed as a triumph over tyranny, actually resulted in tyranny for Catholics.
It's a reminder that revolutions, even those fought in the name of liberty,
right,
can have unintended consequences.
Yeah.
And it underscores the importance of examining history from multiple perspectives,
right,
particularly the perspectives of those who are marginalized and silenced.
Absolutely. And speaking of challenging dominant narratives,
yes,
the source also raises some interesting points about the myths surrounding key figures in this whole saga.
Yes.
It specifically calls out the myths about Louis IV,
right,
the French king who revoked the Edict of Nantes.
Yes, this is where things get really fascinating.
Yeah.
The source challenges the idea that Louis XIV was driven solely by religious zeal when he persecuted the Huguenots.
Okay.
It argues that he was more interested in consolidating his power.
Right.
And creating a French national church under his control.
Interesting.
He even clashed with the Pope on matters of authority.
So the persecution of the Huguenots, well, obviously a terrible tragedy, wasn't just about religious intolerance.
Right.
It was also about power politics and Louis XIV's ambition to control the church.
Exactly. He used the persecution and the rhetoric of defending Catholicism to achieve his own political goals.
Right.
And this undermines this simplistic narrative that often portrays Louis XIV as a puppet master of the Catholic Church, pulling the strings of religious persecution.
It's a reminder that even seemingly religious conflicts often have these deeper political motivations driving them.
They often do.
Yeah. Were there any myths about James II that the source addressed?
Yes, several.
Okay.
One common myth is that James was a cruel and sadistic monarch. Someone who reveled in the use of torture.
Right.
But the source presents a more nuanced view.
Okay.
It acknowledges that this was a brutal era.
Yeah.
But it challenges the notion that James personally enjoyed inflicting pain.
Right. We talked about that accusation.
Yes.
That he may have been present during a torture session in Scotland.
Yes. And while that's a disturbing image,
the
source emphasizes that it's based on a single, unsubstantiated account. There's no evidence that Jitten took any pleasure in such acts.
Okay.
In fact, there's evidence that he opposed excessive violence in other instances.
Interesting.
It seems like the accusations of cruelty were often exaggerated to demonize him and further the anti-Catholic agenda.
It's a classic propaganda technique, isn't it?
It is.
Take a few isolated incidents, blow them out of proportion, and create a monster.
Exactly.
The source also challenges the myth that James was incompetent, particularly as a naval commander.
Right.
It highlights his significant contributions to reforming the English Navy.
Yes.
Which laid the groundwork for its future dominance.
It did.
So it sounds like James II was a far more complex and accomplished figure.
He was.
Than the traditional tyrant label would have us believe.
He was, and to understand him, we need to re-examine this era through a more critical lens.
Okay.
One that takes into account the religious and political biases of the time.
That's what's so great about these deep dives.
They
allow us to see beyond the surface.
Yes.
To uncover these hidden complexities and challenge the stories we've been told.
Exactly. And speaking of challenging narratives,
right.
The source highlights the work of modern historians who are doing just that. It specifically mentions historians like Hilaire Belloc and Hugh Ross Williamson, who have delved into primary sources and offered alternative perspectives on James and the Glorious Revolution.
So it sounds like there's a whole movement of historians who are pushing back against the traditional, often biased view of history.
There is, and it's an important movement because it reminds us that history is not a set of static facts. It's an ongoing conversation. And we all have a responsibility to participate in that conversation.
Absolutely. By questioning the dominant narrative. By seeking out alternative perspectives. We can get a more accurate and nuanced understanding of the past.
A more truthful understanding.
And that's particularly crucial when it comes to events like the Glorious Revolution. Which have been so heavily shaped by religious and political agendas.
Absolutely. It's about reclaiming the lost voices. Giving a platform to those who were marginalized. And ultimately understanding history in a more truthful and compassionate way. You know, it's important to remember that while James II was undoubtedly a victim of anti-Catholic prejudice, he also made some missteps that contributed to his downfall.
So you're saying even though he was working against this tide of religious bias, he didn't always play his cards,
Exactly. He could be quite inflexible and tone-deaf to public perception. Take his insistence on having his Declaration of Indulgence read in all churches. It was meant to promote religious freedom. But it alienated even some of his supporters within the Anglican Church.
So even if his intentions were good, the way he went about things rubbed people the wrong way, like he needed a better PR strategy or something.
Yeah, you could say that.
He seemed to think that reason and logic would win the day, but in a climate of religious anxiety and political maneuvering, things aren't that simple.
No, they're not.
He needed to be more strategic. More sensitive to the political realities of his time.
Absolutely.
It sounds like he was almost too idealistic. Too trusting that people would embrace religious tolerance if he just presented this logical case for it. But history is rarely that neat and tidy.
It isn't. And in the end, those missteps combined with this relentless anti-Catholic sentiment created the perfect storm that swept him from power.
And the consequences for Catholics in England were pretty severe.
They were.
We talked about the Toleration Act of 1689. Which ironically excluded Catholics from its protections.
It's a bitter irony that the so-called Glorious Revolution actually marked a turning point for the worse when it came to religious freedom for Catholics. It solidified the dominance of the Protestant establishment and ushered in an era of renewed persecution.
So while the revolution is often portrayed as this victory for liberty and tolerance, it actually reinforced the very prejudices and injustices it claimed to overthrow.
That's the danger of accepting historical narratives at face value. We need to dig deeper, examine the evidence, and consider the perspectives of those who were marginalized and silenced.
This deep dive has certainly challenged my understanding of the Glorious Revolution.
Good.
It's clear that the traditional narrative, the one we often learn in school, is incomplete. Even misleading at times.
It is, and that's why it's so important to engage with history critically, question the stories we've been told, seek out alternative perspectives.
The story of James II and the Glorious Revolution is a powerful reminder that history is not just this collection of facts.
It's not.
It's a narrative, a story that's often shaped by those in power.
It is.
And as we've seen, that narrative can be used to justify all sorts of injustices.
Absolutely.
By digging deeper. By challenging those dominant narratives. We can uncover the truth. And ensure that the voices of the marginalized are heard.
That's the goal.
Well, this has been a fascinating and at times unsettling journey through history.
It has been.
What's the key takeaway for our listener?
I think the most important takeaway is to cultivate a healthy skepticism toward historical narratives. Don't just accept the dominant story, the one that's often presented in textbooks or popular media. Question it, dig deeper, Seek out multiple perspectives.
Especially when it comes to events like the Glorious Revolution.
Yes.
Where religious and political biases run so deep.
Absolutely. By embracing critical thinking, challenging the stories we've inherited, we can gain a more accurate, inclusive, and ultimately more meaningful understanding of the past.
That's a powerful thought. And on that note, listener, we encourage you to continue this exploration on your own.
Yes.
Dig into the sources we've discussed.
Please do.
Seek out those alternative perspectives and keep questioning the narratives you encounter until next time.
Absolutely.
Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.